Hey everyone! Tonight, we're drifting back to the 19th century, to a world of quiet parlors, ticking clocks, and the faint, ever-present smell of coal gas. So, get comfortable. Dim the lights. Maybe pour yourself some tea, though preferably not from a lead-glazed pot. We're going to wander through the polite but perilous rooms of a Victorian house, where almost everything could, and sometimes did, quietly kill you. The Victorians, bless them, were obsessed with progress. They loved nothing more than a new invention, especially one that promised cleanliness, convenience, or moral improvement. The problem was that many of those bright ideas were, well, lethally bright. Arsenic in the wallpaper. Mercury in the cosmetics. Lead in the pipes. If the Age of Reason had an aesthetic, it was green, a beautiful, poisonous green that could make your skin fall off. Let's start in the drawing room, because that's where the Victorian dream of refinement truly shimmered, and occasionally frothed at the mouth. The drawing room, a well-dressed death trap. Imagine stepping into a middle-class London home around 1860. The fire is lit, the piano polished, and the walls gleam with an emerald hue. It's elegant, fashionable, and also slowly exuding arsenic vapor. The pigment was called Sheely's green, later improved, or worsened, into Paris green. It was the color of prosperity. Drapes, rugs, children's toys, and wallpaper all shimmered with it. People loved it because it made their rooms look alive. Unfortunately, so did the fungus that thrived on it, and when the wallpaper got damp, that fungus released arsenic dust into the air. There were reports of children wasting away mysteriously in their nurseries, coughing and pale, while doctors pondered weak constitutions or bad airs. Nobody thought to blame the wallpaper. Why would they? The Victorians adored wallpaper. A bare wall looked practically immoral. When chemists finally pointed out the danger, the companies producing arsenic pigments denied everything, as companies tend to do. One particularly charming industrialist suggested that if people were dying, it must be from overdecoration. Which, in fairness, might have been true in a different sense. Even after newspapers warned of poison papers, many homeowners refused to remove them. They'd spent good money, after all. And who wanted to admit their living room was trying to murder them? Gaslight and the gentle art of asphyxiation. As night falls, our imaginary Victorian hostess lights the gas lamps. The golden glow is flattering, warm, and slightly noxious. Gaslight was a marvel, it brought the stars indoors. It also leaked carbon monoxide, ate the oxygen from closed rooms, and sometimes exploded without warning. Early gas fixtures were prone to small leaks, especially when the rubber seals aged. Families would drift off to sleep, breathing the faint hiss of progress. If they were lucky, they'd wake with headaches. If not, well, the obituary might mention heart failure, which sounded more respectable than accidentally gassed by own chandelier. Servants were especially vulnerable, since they often slept in basements where the heavy gases pooled. But since domestic staff were cheap and replaceable, few employers found that reason enough to switch to candles. Later, when electricity arrived, some older Victorians complained that it looked too white. They missed the romantic flicker of the gaslight, never mind that it had been slowly killing them for 30 years. Cosmetics of quiet doom. Now, let's drift upstairs to the dressing table, where danger comes in dainty bottles. Victorian women were expected to be delicate, pale, and untroubled by the sun, ideally resembling a slightly undercooked dumpling. To achieve this, they used face powders made with lead carbonate. It provided a perfect milky finish, and also permanent nerve damage. The more devoted among them applied small doses daily, marveling at how the powder seemed to smooth away wrinkles. It did, mostly by paralyzing the muscles beneath. Rouge was sometimes tinted with cinnabar, a bright mineral form of mercury. Lip pomades promised a healthy glow, which was ironic given that mercury poisoning often produced a tremor known as the glassy smile. Imagine your mouth twitching uncontrollably while society compliments your vivacity. Men were no safer. Hair tonics contained lead acetate and sometimes arsenic to stimulate growth. A handsome beard might come at the cost of one's kidneys. But the packaging was exquisite, and isn't that what matters? The kitchen, where progress boiled over. Moving softly down the hallway, we enter the kitchen, that temple of domestic science. Here the Victorians displayed their love of gadgets, ranges, grates, and early gas ovens that hissed reassuringly. The trouble was ventilation. Or rather, the lack of it. Cooking fumes mingled with coal smoke, creating an atmosphere thick enough to chew. The famous London fog wasn't just outdoors. Inside homes, microscopic soot coated the lungs of every resident, creating what physicians gently called the English cough. And then there were the pipes. Water pipes, to be exact, made of lead, because lead was cheap, malleable, and only slightly deadly. Tea brewed with lead-tainted water carried enough metal to slowly poison an entire household. Symptoms included fatigue, irritability, and what doctors called lead palsy, a charming stiffness of the hands that made one's handwriting look as though one were constantly trembling with anticipation. Children absorbed it fastest. They were described as listless, which sounded so much better than brain-damaged. If you survived your childhood tea and reached adulthood, congratulations. You still had the food to worry about. Bread was often whitened with alum, chalk, or even ground bone to give it that refined, civilized appearance. Milk was diluted with river water, the same river that carried the neighborhood sewage. And when you inevitably got sick, the pharmacist could offer you a splendid assortment of patent medicines, most of which contained alcohol, morphine, or opium. For the children, there was Mrs. Winslow's soothing syrup. It was soothing, because it was morphine. The bedroom, dreaming in poison. At last, we reached the bedroom. Soft lamplight, heavy curtains, a four-poster bed piled high with feather pillows. It looks inviting. It smells faintly of death. Mattresses were often stuffed with horsehair or old rags that had been disinfected with mercury chloride. Bed hangings and carpets were dyed with arsenic pigments to match the fashionable greens of the parlor. And to make sure the air stayed warm, many bedrooms had small coal fires, which released sulfur dioxide and carbon monoxide in a cozy, invisible mix. Doctors of the day encouraged fresh air, but they also recommended sealing windows to keep out the miasmas. So Victorians slept in little gas chambers of their own making. If you happened to suffer insomnia, there was laudanum, a tincture of opium widely available over the counter. Taken nightly, it produced beautifully dreamless sleep, right up until the addiction or respiratory failure set in. Famous writers swore by it. Coleridge composed poetry under its influence, while Dickens mentioned it fondly, if hazily. It was, in many ways, the era's true lullaby. Children and the sweet taste of danger. Let's peek into the nursery. It's full of toys, some handmade, some purchased from the latest catalogs. A wooden horse painted a brilliant green. Tin soldiers with cheerful lead helmets. A doll with rosy cheeks courtesy of mercuric pigment. Children, being children, put everything in their mouths. Victorian children, being Victorian, had a solid statistical chance of dying before age 10. Candy, for instance, was sometimes colored with lead chromate to give that perfect golden hue. A few unfortunate confectioners discovered that bright yellow sweets could also mean bright yellow corpses. Then there were the clothes. Those adorable little frocks and bonnets dyed with arsenic greens and aniline purples. Mothers loved how vivid they looked. Doctors loved how predictable the symptoms were. One 19th century case involved a young girl whose skin erupted in lesions each time she wore her new green dress. Her family thought she was allergic to excitement. Eventually someone realized the fabric was basically a wearable pesticide. Plumbing and the perfumed lie. Now, if we drift toward the bathroom, or what passed for one, we meet the grandest illusion of the Victorian age, the idea of sanitation. To be fair, they were trying. Indoor plumbing was a marvel, even if it tended to leak both water and methane. The first flush toilets were triumphs of engineering optimism. Unfortunately, the early S-bend wasn't perfected, so sewer gases had a habit of curling back into the house. Families noticed the smell and responded, logically, with perfume. Perfumed candles. Perfumed waters. Essentially, they layered fragrance atop rot until the house smelled like a floral cemetery. Cholera, typhoid, dysentery, all carried by contaminated water, thrived in this environment. Doctors argued for decades about whether disease came from germs or miasmas. those bad smells of moral decay. Ironically, both were present. So, while the Victorians congratulated themselves on progress, the unseen killers of their homes continued their patient work. The cure was often worse. And when sickness did come, as it inevitably did, the treatments were breathtaking. For anemia, doctors prescribed arsenic tonics in tiny, therapeutic doses. For constipation, mercury-based purgatives. For nerves, bromide salts that slowly ate the brain's ability to think clearly. Even the great Queen Victoria herself dabbled in dubious remedies. She favored patent medicines and homeopathic elixirs, though her physicians probably ensured the doses stayed small. Her subjects were less fortunate. Hospitals dispensed chloroform, carbolic acid, and cocaine solutions with cheerful ignorance. Pharmacists mixed drugs by hand, measuring powders on scales that might also have been used to weigh sugar. And when people began collapsing mysteriously, society assumed they'd caught a touch of the vapors. Progress at any price. Still, we shouldn't be too hard on them. The Victorians genuinely believed they were improving the world. Each innovation, gaslight, synthetic dyes, patent medicines, felt like a step toward modernity. That those steps sometimes led straight into the grave was considered a minor inconvenience. They trusted science, but only halfway. Chemistry was new, exciting, and only slightly understood. Industrialists raced to produce whatever sold, and regulators, well, there weren't any yet. When someone complained that their new wallpaper was killing them, the manufacturer might reply that they should ventilate more or stop licking the walls. Which, admittedly, was good advice generally. By the end of the century, reformers did begin to notice patterns: clusters of illness, sudden deaths, suspiciously green corpses. Medical journals warned about arsenical papers. Laws were passed, gradually, hesitantly. But by then, an entire generation had been quietly marinated in poison. The irony of cleanliness. Perhaps the strangest part is how much of it came from a desire to be clean. Coal smoke was dirty, so people washed more, using soaps adulterated with caustic soda. They scrubbed their floors with disinfectants made from phenol, a substance known to dissolve skin. They dusted, not realizing the dust itself was laced with arsenic and lead. Cleanliness became both moral and mortal. To be dirty was shameful. To be clean was deadly. You couldn't win, but you could at least have matching curtains. Fading into the night. As the century waned, the worst excesses began to fade. Electric light replaced gas. Aniline dyes improved. Arsenic pigments were finally banned, mostly. The new century arrived with confidence in germ theory firmly in hand. Yet the ghosts of the Victorian home lingered, in our plumbing, our paint, even our cosmetics. We're still living, in small ways, with their mistakes. So, as you settle deeper into your pillow tonight, take comfort in the fact that your walls aren't shedding arsenic dust. Your face cream probably won't paralyze you. And your air, though imperfect, won't lull you into an eternal nap. We'll drift, next time, into more of these charming domestic hazards, from deadly corsets to the quiet scandal of early electrical fires. But for now, let's just breathe the safe air of the present, and be quietly grateful for modern regulations. Welcome back. Let's settle a little deeper. The gas lights are flickering softly. The air smells faintly of starch and lavender, and the sound of distant carriage wheels has faded away. Tonight, we're slipping into something far less comfortable, the fashions of the Victorian age. Because, as it turns out, being stylish in the 19th century was a full-contact sport. One that often ended with fainting, bleeding, or, on a particularly fashionable evening, spontaneous combustion. The corset, a hug that didn't end well. Let's begin, gently, with the corset. That masterpiece of engineering designed to turn a human torso into an hourglass, or, depending on your mood, a decorative injury. Victorian women were encouraged to lace tightly. Advertisements promised that a good corset could improve the figure, support the spine, and elevate the morals. Which is quite a list for something made primarily of whalebone and wishful thinking. The logic went like this: if your waist was small enough to be mistaken for a child's, you were virtuous. If you could breathe while doing it, you were doing it wrong. Tight lacing wasn't universal, but it was fashionable among the ambitious middle classes, those desperate to look refined enough to pass for the aristocracy. And refinement, apparently, required partial suffocation. Medical journals of the time described corset liver, a real diagnosis caused by organs being slowly rearranged into a new, more compact configuration. Ribs deformed. Lungs compressed. The stomach politely relocated somewhere near the shoulder blades. Breathing was optional. Elegance was not. And yet, many women swore they felt better with their corsets on, supported, contained, respectable. It's amazing what social pressure and mild hypoxia can do for the mood. Even doctors couldn't agree. Some denounced corsets as instruments of torture, others prescribed them for posture and digestion. The contradiction was very Victorian, equal parts science and self-delusion. Still, women fainted regularly, which society interpreted as delicacy rather than oxygen deprivation. If you collapsed gracefully, you were admired. If you didn't, someone probably blamed your moral fiber. The crinoline, a cage in the name of grace. Now let's move outward, literally, to the crinoline. That vast bell-shaped skirt that made 19th century women look like inverted teacups drifting through parlors. At first, crinolines were made of horsehair and linen. But progress demanded more drama, and so came the steel-hooped versions, light, springy, and extremely flammable. Wearing one meant occupying the space of an entire armchair, which was helpful for discouraging unwanted proximity but inconvenient for basic navigation. Women knocked over tables, trapped small dogs, and occasionally rolled downhill. In a crowded drawing room, a single turn could clear half the guests. The danger came from candles, fireplaces, and oil lamps, of which Victorian homes had plenty. The hoop skirt acted like a sail, catching flames beautifully. There were hundreds of recorded deaths, most described euphemistically as tragic accidents during dressing. Queen Victoria herself reportedly forbade her daughters from wearing them near open fires after a maid caught alight while lighting the grate. That didn't end the trend, of course. Nothing says civilization quite like dying for silhouette symmetry. There's even a grim little statistic. By the 1860s, newspapers claimed that an average of 3 women per week in Britain died from crinoline fires. Which is impressive, in a macabre way. But society moved on, as it always does, to the next uncomfortable miracle. The bustle, because nature wasn't trying hard enough. By the 1870s, fashion decided the bell shape was passé. Now, the ideal figure was flatter in front and dramatically inflated in the back, as if one were permanently reversing into something expensive. Enter the bustle, a padded, sometimes metal-framed contraption designed to exaggerate the posterior into heroic proportions. Women teetered through ballrooms, balancing entire ecosystems of fabric behind them. Sitting required precision. Stairs were a gamble. And heaven help you if someone opened a door too quickly. Bustles were sometimes made of wire mesh, sometimes of whalebone, occasionally of inflatable rubber. Yes, air-filled versions existed. The squeaking was said to be mortifying. But at least it was safer than spontaneous combustion. Men, of course, declared the look absurd, while simultaneously demanding it. Which sums up a good deal of fashion history. The gentleman's problem. Lest we pity only the women, let's drift toward the men's wardrobe, a smaller but equally perilous arena. Victorian gentlemen dressed as though expecting to be buried at a moment's notice, layers of dark wool, stiff collars, and starched cuffs that could double as bladed weapons. Those high, rigid collars were particularly dangerous. Nicknamed father killers, they could press against the carotid arteries if too tight, occasionally causing fainting or, in a few recorded cases, actual strangulation. Imagine being found dead in your best suit, defeated by your own neckwear. Very dignified. Then there were the hair products. Brilliantine, pomade, and oil, all generously applied, many containing lead acetate. Your hair shone, your scalp itched, and your health declined in quiet harmony. And the hats, heavy felt top hats stiffened with mercury compounds. Hatters inhaled mercury vapor daily, leading to tremors, hallucinations, and the charming expression "mad as a hatter." It wasn't just a metaphor, it was a workplace diagnosis. The wearers themselves didn't fare much better. Long exposure to hat linings could cause low-level mercury poisoning, resulting in anxiety, fatigue, and that nervous Victorian stare you see in every sepia portrait. The dyes that glowed and killed. Color was everything. Before the mid-19th century, dyes came from plants, insects, or minerals, beautiful, but limited. Then came synthetic dyes, born accidentally in a chemistry lab. In 1856, an 18-year-old chemist named William Perkin tried to make artificial quinine and instead produced a vivid purple. He called it mauveine. The world went mad for it. Every fashionable lady wanted mauve gowns, mauve gloves, mauve ribbons. Even Queen Victoria wore mauve to her daughter's wedding, which sealed its reign as the color of the decade. Unfortunately, the process of making it involved coal tar and arsenic residues. Factories belched fumes. Workers coughed blood. But society looked radiant, so that was all right. Other synthetic colors followed, bright reds, blues, greens, many containing aniline compounds that irritated the skin and occasionally caused chemical burns. But what's a rash compared to being fashionable? There were reports of factory girls whose hands turned blue or purple from handling dyes. They were nicknamed Violet Girls, as if that made it charming. Even gloves and stockings could stain the skin with toxic pigments that entered through pores. Fashion wasn't skin deep, it went all the way in. Jewelry, the subtle sparkle of arsenic and uranium. Now let's talk about accessories, those finishing touches of elegance that completed a look, and sometimes, a life. Victorian jewelry often incorporated dangerous materials simply because they looked pretty. Green glass made from uranium oxide produced a lovely glow under gaslight. It also emitted low levels of radiation. In fairness, nobody knew that yet. They just thought it looked peculiarly lively. Artificial pearls were coated in something called essence d'Orient, a mixture containing fish scales and ammonia. Over time, the ammonia fumes corroded the metal settings and, incidentally, the wearer's skin. And for a truly glamorous sparkle, some hairpins and brooches were polished with compounds containing arsenic or mercury. The motto seemed to be, if it gleams, it's worth dying for. The smell of civilization. Perfume was another subtle assassin. While the Victorians adored fragrance, many perfumes were concocted with dangerous solvents like benzene or chloroform to help dissolve ingredients. Women dabbed them behind the ears, men sprinkled them on handkerchiefs, and both inhaled daily doses of mild anesthesia. The perfume bottle was an alchemist's dream: violet petals, ambergris, musk, and a dash of industrial solvent. A blend of romance and refinery waste. Of course, most people never questioned it. The Victorians had a near magical faith that pleasant smells equaled health. If it was fragrant, it couldn't be bad. The same logic, unfortunately, applied to their air fresheners, which often contained formaldehyde. Morning clothes, a sorrowful hazard. Victorians didn't just dress to impress, they dressed to grieve. Morning fashion was an art form, especially after Queen Victoria lost Prince Albert and decided to make bereavement her full-time occupation. Widows were expected to wear black crepe, a dull, heavy fabric that looked appropriately tragic and shed microscopic particles of dye and fiber. These fibers were loaded with aniline dyes and carbon dust, making them highly irritating to lungs and skin. Professional mourners, undertakers, and seamstresses who handled mourning clothes developed persistent coughs and skin ulcers. It was literally sickening to serve sorrow. Still, everyone followed the royal example. To appear cheerful after a death was considered indecent. And if you happened to dye yourself while observing etiquette, well, at least you looked respectful doing it. The paradox of progress. When you add it all up, Victorian fashion begins to look less like elegance and more like a series of well-dressed accidents. Corsets rearranged the organs. Crinolines combusted. Collars choked. Dyes poisoned. And jewelry glowed faintly in the dark. Yet every one of these things was celebrated as modern, civilized, and proof that humanity was moving forward. That was the paradox of the Victorian world: progress at any cost, even the wearer's ability to breathe. The Industrial Revolution made clothing cheaper, brighter, and more available. For the first time, middle-class families could imitate aristocratic styles. They did so eagerly, even if it meant dying in color-coordinated agony. fashionable medicine. Some manufacturers even marketed their products as healthful. Corsets were sold as orthopedic aids. Lead cosmetics were advertised as purifying. And mercury ointments were recommended for acne and freckles. If you objected, people called you morbid or unladylike. After all, a little sacrifice was a small price for beauty. Besides, medicine was hardly safer, so why not choose the prettier poison? The public didn't fully turn against these trends until late in the century, when new science and a few high-profile deaths made denial difficult. By then, tens of thousands had quietly suffered for the sake of fashion. And, in true Victorian spirit, they did it politely. The gentle fade. As the century drew to a close, styles softened. Corsets loosened slightly. Skirts slimmed down. Synthetic dyes became less deadly. The silhouette of death gave way to something almost breathable. But the obsession with appearance, with perfection through discomfort, never really left. It simply changed materials. So as you breathe slowly now, imagining the rustle of silk and the faint whisper of starch, think kindly of those who came before. They suffered beautifully so we could wear elastic waistbands in peace. Let's drift onward, then, from the ballroom to the boudoir, where another quiet killer waited, the cosmetics cabinet and the early beauty industry that promised eternal youth, one toxic jar at a time. Hey everyone! Welcome back. The fire's burning low tonight, and the room feels comfortably heavy, the kind of quiet that makes time move slower. Let's drift, gently, toward the dressing table. You know the one, carved wood, soft velvet stool, mirror framed in brass. The surface gleams with little bottles, brushes, powders, and creams. They look innocent enough. They weren't. The Victorians were in love with the idea of beauty as moral virtue. If you looked pure, people assumed you were pure. A clear complexion meant a clear conscience. And if you had to use a few industrial byproducts to achieve that, well, progress always leaves a little residue. The pale ideal. The 19th century adored pallor. Not the healthy kind. Not the just woke up from a nap kind. The goal was a shade somewhere between ethereal and medically concerning. In an age before sunscreen, tan skin meant you worked outdoors, in other words, that you were poor. A pale face said you were refined, delicate, safely indoors, and possibly near death. Perfect. To achieve this, women applied Venetian ceruse, a white paste made of lead carbonate and vinegar. It smoothed the skin wonderfully, in the sense that it slowly dissolved it. Lead penetrated through pores, entered the bloodstream, and lodged itself happily in bones. The longer you used it, the paler you became. Also the sicker. Symptoms included muscle weakness, insomnia, blackened gums, and the charming blue line around the mouth that doctors came to recognize as the beauty mark of death. Still, it sold briskly. Even Queen Elizabeth I had used a similar formula centuries earlier, so it must have been fine. Right? Mercury, the secret ingredient for a brilliant complexion. When lead alone wasn't enough, there was mercury. It gave cosmetics a certain brightness, a luminous, porcelain finish that glowed under candlelight. Unfortunately, it also caused tremors, anxiety, and what one physician politely described as progressive mental decline. But people didn't talk about side effects then. They just talked about radiance. Mercury-based creams promised to fade freckles, remove wrinkles, and lighten blemishes of the moral and epidermal variety. Some even claimed to improve character. Which makes sense, if your definition of improvement includes irreversible nerve damage. Men weren't immune to vanity either. Barbers offered mercury ointments for shaving rash and gentle bleaching of the beard. One can only imagine the scent, part cologne, part chemistry set. But the advertising was irresistible. Each jar came with delicate typography and vague French phrases, the universal language of legitimacy. Belladonna eyes. Then there were the eyes. The Victorians prized a soft, dreamy gaze, the kind that suggested sensitivity, emotion, and an underlying vitamin deficiency. To achieve that look, women used drops made from belladonna, literally beautiful woman. The extract, taken from the deadly nightshade plant, dilated the pupils and gave the eyes a dark, glassy shine. It was mesmerizing. it was also toxic. The drops blurred vision, increased heart rate, and in high doses could cause hallucinations. But a little danger was the price of allure. Some women, unable to afford belladonna, tried to mimic the effect with small doses of atropine, same chemical family, same problem. The result was a society full of faintly staggering women, blinking attractively into the distance. Arsenic wafers, the snack of the refined. If applying poison to your face seemed too cautious, you could always eat it. Dr. Fowler's arsenic solution was marketed as a health tonic. Small pills and wafers promised to improve the complexion, invigorate the constitution, and purify the blood. And indeed, arsenic did clear the skin, by killing the bacteria responsible for blemishes. And sometimes the user. There were even beauty arsenic wafers sold by mail order, often endorsed by imaginary duchesses. Each package instructed the buyer to start with 1 wafer per day and increase slowly, until the desired clarity is achieved. Which is one way to describe organ failure. One American newspaper joked that arsenic was the secret of the rosy Austrian complexion, though in truth, the secret was probably the local water supply. Still, the rumor stuck. And so did the poisoning. The practice continued well into the early 20th century, long after science had politely begged everyone to stop. Rouge, lip salves, and the great cosmetic pretend. Despite all this, naturalness was still the official ideal. Makeup was considered suspicious, something worn by actresses, courtesans, or worse, French women. So women learned the art of looking effortlessly enhanced. They pinched their cheeks, bit their lips, and used homemade rouge made from crushed cochineal insects mixed with ammonia. Some used carmine, others used red mercuric sulfide, cinnabar, ground into powder. A little dab created a perfect flush. A few dabs created tremors. Lip color was sold discreetly as toilet wax or lip pomade. Respectable ladies pretended they didn't use it, while clearly using it. A shared societal game, everyone knew, but everyone agreed not to say. Even toothpaste could be dangerous, some contained hydrochloric acid to whiten and invigorate the gums. It did whiten. It also removed the enamel, which is efficient, if not ideal. The fragrance of forgetfulness. Perfume, too, had its risks. Victorian perfumers experimented endlessly with solvents, using benzene, chloroform, and ether to extract floral oils. The results smelled divine and caused mild euphoria, partly from the chemical fumes. Scent was deeply tied to morality. A properly perfumed woman was considered civilized, orderly, perhaps even godly. The unperfumed were suspect. And so, the air itself became part of social performance. Women layered scent on their clothes, hair, and even undergarments. Some fainted during church services when the combination of perfume and corsetry proved too ambitious. Others simply enjoyed the pleasant dizziness, mistaking it for romance. The men's vanity cabinet. Gentlemen's grooming, though more subdued, wasn't immune to folly. Hair tonics often contained lead acetate and sulfur, promising to restore color to graying hair. They worked, in a sense, the chemical reaction darkened hair temporarily. It also darkened the scalp permanently. Shaving creams included phenol and borax, both strong irritants. To soothe the resulting rash, barbers applied mercury-based balms. The Victorian morning routine was essentially a slow-motion chemistry experiment. And then there was cologne. Bay rum, a popular scent, combined alcohol, cloves, and bay leaves with small amounts of industrial solvent. Splashed liberally on the face after shaving, it provided a refreshing sting, and a reminder that progress sometimes hurts. Wigs, powders, and the great disguise. Wigs were less common than in the 18th century, but hairpieces persisted. They were cleaned with ammonia and bleached with chlorine, then powdered with starch or rice dust to hide the smell. Unfortunately, that powder made an excellent home for lice. There were entire industries devoted to wig fumigation, a phrase that says everything about the 19th century's commitment to both elegance and parasites. Some wig makers used arsenical soap to treat the hair, a disinfectant that worked beautifully until one's scalp began to itch in interesting ways. But vanity, as ever, was stronger than reason. The tragic glow of radiance. By the end of the century, science had discovered something new: radiation. It was invisible, modern, and everyone assumed healthy. Products containing radium and thorium entered the beauty market. Face creams glowed faintly in the dark. Toothpastes promised atomic whiteness. It was the perfect symbol of modern beauty, shining, mysterious, and quietly disintegrating its users. It's easy to laugh now, but the logic was familiar. Victorians had always believed that anything new must also be good. If arsenic could make you fair, why shouldn't radium make you radiant? One French company even sold the Radia face cream in the early 1900s, claiming its formula was scientifically approved by doctors. The doctor in question was also the company owner. Naturally, beauty is suffering. Behind all this was a deep, unspoken idea that beauty required endurance. The more painful the process, the more noble the result. Women prided themselves on their ability to tolerate discomfort gracefully. In that sense, the toxic beauty industry fit perfectly with the moral tone of the age. Virtue was measured not by joy, but by how elegantly one could suffer. To apply arsenic daily and still smile at dinner was practically saintly. Men admired it, doctors rationalized it, and society applauded it. A world built on quiet poison couldn't have existed otherwise. The cosmetic counter turned scientific. Toward the very end of the Victorian era, chemistry began to catch up with common sense. Public health movements gained ground. A few reformers started asking awkward questions like, should our face cream contain neurotoxins? By the 1890s, safer ingredients like zinc oxide and lanolin were replacing the worst offenders. But the damage was done, both to the bodies of millions and to the notion that beauty could ever be harmless. Even in the early 20th century, old habits lingered. Arsenic wafers were still advertised. Lead-based powders remained on dressing tables. The world moves slowly when profit wears a pretty face. The quiet consequences. The irony is that most of these poisons worked, at least temporarily. Arsenic did clear the skin. Mercury did make the complexion luminous. Lead did produce an even tone. And belladonna really did make eyes larger. Each product delivered its promise, for a while. That's what made it so difficult to stop. When the side effects appeared, tremors, fatigue, teeth falling out, people assumed it was something else. The air, perhaps. Or melancholy. Certainly not the miracle cream everyone was buying. And besides, no one wants to believe that beauty itself is killing them. It's bad for sales. Fading reflections. As we leave the Victorian dressing table, let's pause for a last look. The mirror is fogged slightly from the warmth of the room. You can see the faint outline of powders and brushes, a ghostly haze of vanity and industry. Somewhere, a chemist in a London laboratory is preparing a new formula, convinced he's found the next harmless improvement. A duchess is writing a testimonial. A shopgirl is saving for her own little jar of transformation. They're all gone now, of course. But their dream lingers in every cosmetic aisle, in every promise of purity and perfection that still floats through advertisements today. The ingredients may have changed, but the idea that beauty is worth a little harm never really left. So, let's exhale. Close the jar. And drift from the vanity table into the next room, where the dangers weren't cosmetic, but structural. Because in the Victorian world, even the architecture could betray you. Close your eyes for a moment. Imagine you're stepping into a perfect Victorian parlor. It's late evening. A soft amber glow spills from the gas lamps. The furniture gleams, dark mahogany, heavy and ornate. Thick curtains guard the windows, shutting out the chill London fog. The carpet smells faintly of roses. And the walls, oh, the walls, are a lush shade of green. It's beautiful. It's fashionable. It's arsenic. Green, the color of death. Victorian society adored the color green. It felt fresh, natural, a reminder of the countryside in an age choking on coal dust. But nature had to be manufactured. The most popular pigment of the era was Scheele's green, a stunning, vivid hue discovered in the 1770s. Its secret ingredient, copper arsenite. Yes, arsenic again. The same chemical that appeared in beauty creams and rat poison now coated the walls of the well-to-do. When wallpaper designers embraced this color, homes became silent theaters of toxicity. Every roll was a chemical masterpiece, layered with glue, pigment, and enough arsenic to wipe out a small family of mice. When gaslights warmed the walls, or damp air loosened the paper, microscopic particles drifted into the air. Each breath became a small dose of death. The wallpaper that whistled. In 1857, a British physician named Lethaby analyzed the green wallpaper in a child's nursery. It contained enough arsenic to kill 2 adults if ingested. He warned that it might also poison through the air. Manufacturers dismissed him. They said his claims were unscientific. But children kept getting sick. They developed strange symptoms: vomiting, nosebleeds, fainting fits, sores that wouldn't heal. Doctors blamed everything: bad milk, bad water, bad morals, everything except the elegant wallpaper. When finally someone noticed that the illness stopped after the wallpaper was removed, it seemed almost rude to mention. After all, who wants to admit that beauty can murder politely? The poison room. In one tragic case, a young girl named Agnes, living in a London townhouse, grew weak and feverish. Her mother was told it was consumption, tuberculosis. But the maid who slept in the same room also fell ill. And the cat. When they stripped the walls for cleaning, the workers' hands blistered from touching the paper. It was arsenic green. One doctor described these rooms as gas chambers of fashion. Each damp morning, a new cloud of invisible poison rose like incense. And yet, guests still admired the decor. It was, after all, the latest pattern from William Morris and Company. The irony of William Morris. William Morris, poet, designer, socialist, was one of the great names in Victorian art. His wallpapers are still considered masterpieces today. Delicate vines, curling leaves, perfect harmony between art and nature. But for years, his pigments were made with arsenic. Morris himself dismissed the rumors, saying the talk of arsenic poisoning is all a red herring. Which is ironic, considering his family owned one of Britain's largest arsenic mines. He was probably sincere, genuinely unaware of the scale of the danger. In the Victorian world, ignorance was easy to confuse with innocence. The lethal glow. The wallpaper wasn't alone in its toxicity. Gaslighting, the marvel of the age, filled homes with carbon monoxide and sulfur dioxide. Every flickering flame quietly consumed oxygen and replaced it with something less hospitable. Families gathered under chandeliers powered by thin pipes of gas, often leaking unseen. If a jet burned low overnight, it could flood the room with fumes. Morning often brought headaches, fatigue, or, occasionally, silence. And still, people called it modern convenience. Some homeowners installed ventilators, not realizing that the fresh air passed through lead pipes. In trying to breathe cleaner, they inhaled poison more efficiently. Paint, pipes, and poison water. Lead was everywhere. It lined pipes, coated walls, sealed bathtubs, and sweetened wine. Yes, sweetened. A touch of lead acetate gave cider and port a pleasant taste. Children chewed on windowsills painted with lead-based pigments, developing what was called painter's colic. Servants, cleaning those same surfaces, developed tremors and dull eyes. Doctors called it domestic palsy. Even the fashionable new enameled bathtubs released lead into the water. Soaking in luxury came with an invisible cost. And then there was plumbing. London's pipes, made of lead, carried water infused with just enough metal to keep everyone slightly ill and permanently tired. People called it the London complexion, that grayish, ghostly hue. They thought it was the fog. Carpets and curtains, dust as death. The Victorian home was designed to trap dust. Thick carpets, velvet drapes, upholstered furniture, all cozy, all suffocating. Coal soot settled on every surface, mixing with the microscopic flakes of arsenic and lead already floating through the air. Each breath was a cocktail of progress. Housewives dusted endlessly, unaware that the effort itself stirred the poison. Servants, constantly exposed, developed chronic coughs and fainting spells. It wasn't hysteria. It was chemistry. The nursery's curse. Children were the most vulnerable. They played on the carpet, sucked their fingers, breathed closer to the floor. Toy paint, too, often contained lead and mercury. Even dolls' glass eyes were polished with arsenic compounds to make them shine. There's a strange sadness in that detail, little faces crafted from the same poison that would sicken the girls who played with them. Doctors began to notice patterns. Wealthy families, proud of their lavish nurseries, had more cases of mysterious child illnesses than poor families living in bare rooms. Poverty, it seemed, was occasionally safer. The wallpaper that sang in the dark. As gaslight flickered, certain wallpapers shimmered faintly. Not metaphorically, literally. The chemical reactions between damp air, mold, and arsenic compounds sometimes caused the paper to emit phosphorescent gases. Visitors described the eerie glow as magical. They had no idea they were admiring a faint emission of toxic hydrogen arsenide. One chemist tested a sample and noted that it whistled faintly when heated, the sound of gas escaping. He called it the singing wallpaper. London society called it charming. The airless room. Ventilation was considered dangerous in the Victorian home. People feared drafts, the so-called miasma, or bad air, thought to carry disease. So windows stayed shut. Curtains thickened. And air, trapped and heated, turned poisonous. The irony is unbearable. They sealed themselves in to keep out imaginary sickness, and in doing so, created real sickness. Poisonous progress. What's remarkable isn't that Victorians used so many toxic materials, it's that they did so proudly. Each invention, each color, each new technology felt like a step toward a better world. If something caused discomfort, it was simply the price of advancement. Factories poured smoke into the air, calling it the smell of industry. Homes glittered with arsenical paper, calling it the mark of taste. And people coughed politely, convinced that beauty was worth the ache. The slow awakening. By the late 1800s, reformers began to fight back. A few bold doctors spoke publicly about the link between sickness and domestic decor. They were ridiculed at first. Who would believe that something so fashionable could be so foul? Then came the chemists. Testing wallpaper scrapings, they found arsenic levels hundreds of times higher than safe limits. Journalists began to print scandalous headlines. Death lurking in the drawing room. Arsenic in the nursery. Public panic followed. Mothers tore down wallpaper with their bare hands. Manufacturers quietly changed formulas, replacing arsenic with safer pigments like chrome or zinc green. By the 1890s, the worst of the wallpapers had disappeared, replaced by the next generation of household hazards. The ghost in the house. Even after the poisons faded, the idea of the dangerous home lingered. Writers used it as metaphor, the haunted house, the cursed room, the ghostly presence that makes you ill. Sometimes the ghost wasn't supernatural at all. It was just chemistry. There's something haunting about that. To realize that comfort itself was the killer. That the home, the sanctuary, was quietly consuming the people who loved it most. The green remnant. Today, collectors still find Victorian wallpaper sealed behind newer plaster. If they scrape too hard, the dust still tests positive for arsenic. The color remains vivid, stubbornly lovely. It's hard not to admire it, that brilliant emerald, frozen in time. The shade that once made rooms glow with elegance and death. In museums, curators handle samples with gloves and respirators. They whisper about how beauty once meant danger. And how progress, without caution, is just a prettier form of ruin. The house sleeps. So tonight, if you glance around your own room, painted walls, steady light, clean air. Remember that comfort is a recent invention. 2 centuries ago, every breath in a well-decorated home was a gamble. Each pattern, each pigment, a choice between elegance and endurance. And somewhere, deep beneath layers of paint and plaster, a trace of that Victorian green might still be sleeping. Waiting patiently. Beautifully. Poisonously. Forever fashionable. Step outside your imaginary Victorian home for a moment. It's morning. Or at least, it should be. You open the door, and instead of daylight, you meet a wall of soft, yellowish air. It moves slowly, like breathing bread dough. You can taste it. You can't see across the street. and you start to wonder, faintly, if the sky has gone missing again. Welcome to Victorian London, the city where the air itself was alive, but not in a good way. The Great London Fog. London's famous fog wasn't really fog. It was smoke, millions of coal fires belching soot, mixed with mist from the Thames. It clung to everything, your clothes, your lungs, even your teeth. Writers called it the London particular. A charming name, as though it were a local delicacy rather than a semi-solid gas. On bad days, the air turned the color of weak pea soup. On worse days, it was the color of despair. People stumbled through the streets carrying small torches just to see their own feet. Cab horses had to be led by hand. And somewhere in the murk, you could hear the distant, resigned coughing of an empire. The price of progress. The Industrial Revolution had made Britain rich, but it also made it wheeze. Coal powered everything, factories, trains, ships, and every hearth in every house. Each chimney spat out its own contribution to the great, communal lung. The government measured industrial success in smoke. A clean sky, they thought, meant economic failure. Even Queen Victoria herself once asked why the palace windows were always dirty. She was told, politely, that it was prosperity settling out of the air. The smell of civilization. The scent of 19th century London was complicated. Imagine a blend of coal soot, horse manure, rotting vegetables, and a hint of sewage for personality. Add a sprinkle of acid fog from nearby factories, and you have the perfume of progress. It wasn't just unpleasant, it was corrosive. People's clothes wore out faster. Metal railings melted. Stone carvings dissolved into ghostly lumps. When it rained, the water that ran off the rooftops was tinted gray and faintly acidic. Umbrellas didn't protect you. They just made sure the filth hit your shoes instead of your head. Breathing for a living. Workers in industrial cities were essentially paid to inhale smoke. Chimney sweeps, coal men, factory laborers, all came home blackened to the bone. Their lungs looked like burned parchment by age 30. Doctors had polite names for it. Smoker's lung. Black phthisis. Industrial asthma. But among the poor, it was simply called the cough. Everyone had it. Even the healthy ones coughed like dying poets. And the dying poets wrote about the fog as if it were a friend. Dickens' misty nightmare. Charles Dickens adored describing fog. He wrote about it in Bleak House, calling it the great symbol of London, thick, relentless, and oddly moral. It wasn't just weather to him. It was a personality. Something oppressive, that made everything a little slower, a little sadder. What he didn't mention was that every time he wrote about it, he was breathing in sulfuric acid. But then again, who wasn't? The fog that killed. Every few years, the fog got bad enough to kill outright. In 1873, one such episode smothered the city for 5 days. Nearly 700 people died. The newspapers called it the Black Winter. But the worst came later, in December 1952, long after Victoria's death, when the Great Smog descended. For 5 days, London disappeared under a yellow-brown cloud. Buses stopped. Ambulances couldn't move. People died in their beds, suffocated by the air of their own city. More than 12,000 people were dead before it cleared. It was the modern echo of a Victorian problem, a reminder that progress rarely stops poisoning you just because you ask politely. The gaslight effect. Let's drift back to the 19th century again, before electricity. London at night was lit by gas, thousands of flickering lamps powered by coal gas. Each one hissed softly, leaking carbon monoxide into the streets. The light was beautiful, soft, and golden. The side effects were less so. Gas workers regularly died of poisoning. Leaks in homes caused slow asphyxiation, sometimes mistaken for nervous collapse. Yet people adored it. They called gaslight romantic. Which is true, if your idea of romance involves dizziness, hallucinations, and a gentle sense of impending doom. The river that reeked. The air was bad. The water, worse. The Thames was an open sewer, swollen with industrial runoff and human waste. In the summer heat of 1858, the stench grew so unbearable that Parliament itself had to flee the city. They called it the Great Stink. For weeks, Londoners lived in a haze of filth and perfume-soaked handkerchiefs. Desperate officials tried hanging sheets soaked in chloride of lime over windows to mask the smell. Naturally, it made things worse. Out of this olfactory nightmare came the first real step toward modern sanitation, Joseph Bazalgette's Great Sewer System. A marvel of engineering, it quietly saved more lives than all the monarchs combined. The coal-dusted sky. Victorian skies were never blue. They were shades of brown, gray, or greenish-yellow, depending on wind direction. Sunlight filtered through layers of soot like candlelight through dirty glass. Artists like Turner captured it beautifully, those soft, hazy skies that look like dawn forever suspended. In reality, it was pollution. His famous atmospheric paintings were, essentially, portraits of smog. We like to call them masterpieces now. At the time, they were just accurate. Health in the haze. City doctors started to notice curious trends. Children raised in the countryside grew taller, stronger, and lived longer. City children didn't. There was even a phrase, the London look. It meant pale skin, watery eyes, and a chest that wheezed like an old bellows. Upper-class families sent their children away to the countryside for fresh air, while continuing to burn half a ton of coal every winter themselves. The contradiction didn't seem to bother anyone. The black snow. On especially bad days, soot fell from the sky like snow. It gathered on windowsills, on hats, on everything. Children built tiny black snowmen in alleyways. When it melted, the runoff left greasy streaks that stained stone and brick alike. Victorian Londoners accepted this as normal, as inevitable as nightfall. Some even found comfort in it. After all, as long as the air stayed dirty, it meant the factories were running, and the empire was alive. Clean air was for the idle and the poor. Smoke was the sin of ambition. The hypocrisy of cleanliness. Victorians were obsessed with hygiene. They bathed in filtered water, polished their silver, and disinfected their hands. But they lived inside an atmosphere that could kill a horse. Soap advertisements promised purity. Meanwhile, the very coal that powered the soap factories was blackening the lungs of their workers. It was a perfect paradox, a clean conscience wrapped in a dirty cloud. A small moment of clarity. Occasionally, a crisp wind from the sea would sweep through the city and clear the air. For a brief day or two, the sky would turn blue. People would stare upward in shock, as if the heavens had been repainted overnight. Then the wind would shift, and the color would drain away again, replaced by that familiar gray sky. London, once more, retreated into its own exhalation. The poetic illness. Among writers and artists, sickness became romantic. Pale faces and hollow eyes were seen as signs of sensitivity. Tuberculosis, in particular, was called the artist's disease. They believed that breathing polluted air, living half-sick, somehow made one more creative. It's hard not to admire the commitment. They were literally dying for aesthetic. The law finally notices. By the 1890s, public health reformers began pushing for cleaner air. Parliament reluctantly passed the first smoke abatement laws. Factory owners ignored them. After all, pollution didn't vote. It would take another 60 years, and thousands of deaths, before the Clean Air Act of 1956 finally declared that perhaps visibility was, in fact, desirable. The quiet cost. The poison in the air didn't just scar lungs, it shaped lives. It dictated where people lived, how they worked, and how long they survived. It crept into art, literature, and even memory. When people spoke of London fog, they spoke with affection, as though the very thing that choked them was part of their identity. It's a strange human trait, to romanticize the thing that harms us. To mistake endurance for beauty. Breathing easier. Today, the fog is gone. The Thames runs cleaner. The air smells mostly of rain and exhaust instead of coal and death. But every now and then, on cold winter mornings, a faint mist rises above the river. And for a moment, London looks almost the same as it did in the 19th century. Soft, quiet, mysterious. If you didn't know better, you might think it was beautiful. And it is, from a distance. Just don't breathe too deeply. Hey everyone. Still awake? If not, don't worry, we're about to talk about medicine. That should do the trick. Now, medicine in the 19th century was a peculiar blend of confidence and complete guesswork. Doctors wore fine coats, spoke with authority, and prescribed substances that could dissolve wallpaper. And somehow, everyone trusted them. The Victorians loved to take something deadly, put it in a smaller bottle, and call it health. The golden age of poison. The 1800s were, in many ways, the golden age of poison, not because people wanted to kill, but because they wanted to heal. And the line between the two was mostly a matter of dosage. Arsenic, mercury, lead, opium, laudanum, they were all considered medical marvels. If it burned, tingled, or made you hallucinate slightly, it was probably good for you. Doctors treated ailments with the same enthusiasm as chefs experimenting with new spices. The results were rarely appetizing. Laudanum, the mother's little helper. Let's begin with the Victorian favorite, laudanum. It was everywhere. A reddish-brown liquid, sweetened with alcohol and opium. Sold freely over the counter. It soothed pain, quieted coughs, and most importantly, it made people stop caring. Writers loved it. So did mothers, factory workers, and anyone living within sight of a coal chimney. It was the 19th century equivalent of a weighted blanket, a glass of wine, and a mild coma all at once. Infants were given Godfrey's cordial, also known as the mother's friend. It was essentially baby laudanum. A few drops calmed even the fussiest child. It also, tragically, stopped quite a few of them permanently. But because babies can't file complaints, the practice continued for decades. Mercury, the liquid healer. If a Victorian doctor didn't know what was wrong with you, and he rarely did, he probably prescribed mercury. Mercury was the cure for everything. Fever, syphilis, constipation, melancholy. It didn't fix any of these things, but it made your symptoms so spectacular that no one could accuse the doctor of inaction. The phrase of vigorous treatment usually meant you will be mildly dissolving by Thursday. Patients drooled, lost their teeth, and occasionally their sanity. Their gums turned black, their hair fell out, and their bones softened. But still, progress. Even when evidence mounted that mercury might not be ideal, the medical community clung to it. After all, it did make you sweat, tremble, and purge, all things Victorians associated with getting the poison out. Ironically, they were putting it in. Arsenic, the beauty regimen. Arsenic was not just a household poison, it was a skincare secret. Women took tiny doses to improve complexion. It made the skin pale, the eyes bright, and the hair glossy. It also made your organs surrender one by one, but that part took a while, and vanity doesn't have patience for detail. Arsenic wafers were advertised as safe, because of course they were. The same advertisements also featured smiling women who, statistically speaking, were unlikely to smile for long. Men took arsenic tonics to enhance virility. And yes, those too were short-term solutions to long-term problems. Strychnine and the tonic craze. Strychnine, yes, the rat poison, was another medical favorite. In small doses, it acted as a stimulant. Doctors believed it could strengthen weak muscles, improve digestion, and sharpen the mind. It also caused violent convulsions if you sneezed too enthusiastically, but details. Victorians adored their tonics. Invigorating elixirs, nerve restoratives, electrophosphoric essences. They were basically caffeine, alcohol, opium, and a touch of snake venom, shaken, not stirred. You could buy them at chemists, general stores, or from the back of a wagon accompanied by a man in a top hat calling himself professor. Cocaine, the gentleman's pick-me-up. By the late 19th century, cocaine had joined the party. It was refined, respectable, and highly effective if your goal was to be briefly invincible and permanently unhinged. Doctors prescribed it for exhaustion, toothache, hay fever, and melancholy. Sigmund Freud called it a magical drug, until he realized it was also a magical way to ruin friendships. It was even an ingredient in the original formula for Coca-Cola. Imagine drinking a cool glass of liquid alertness that made your eyebrows vibrate. Victorians loved it. They had no idea why they suddenly wanted to rearrange the furniture at 3 a.m., but they assumed it was good health. The electric cure. Electricity fascinated Victorians. It was new, mysterious, and clearly useful for something, even if no one was quite sure what. So naturally, they decided it must cure disease. Electrotherapy salons popped up everywhere. Patients were strapped into machines that delivered mild shocks to various body parts, sometimes chosen at random. For female hysteria, there were electric corsets. For nervous disorders, electric belts. For men seeking renewed vigor, electric trousers. Yes, those existed. The shocks were meant to stimulate vital energy. Mostly, they stimulated regret. Bloodletting, the old faithful. Despite all these innovations, Victorians still adored the oldest treatment of all, bloodletting. Because if you're sick, surely you just have too much blood. Doctors used leeches, lancets, or a contraption called a scarificator, a cheerful little box with spring-loaded blades. A sore throat? Remove a pint. A fever? 2 pints. Headache? Better make it 3, just in case. Patients often fainted. Doctors called that a sign the treatment is working. It's hard to argue with that kind of logic, mostly because you're unconscious. The doctor's dilemma. Medicine in this era was a performance. The doctor had to do something, even if that something involved applying mustard to your chest or bathing your feet in vinegar. People expected visible action. A prescription had to sting, burn, or sparkle ominously in the bottle to feel legitimate. If a patient survived, the doctor was praised. If not, well, at least they tried. One could say the true miracle was surviving medical care at all. The patent medicine empire. By mid-century, patent medicines were everywhere, unregulated, profitable, and utterly random. The labels promised miracles. Dr. Bliss's fever destroyer. Mrs. Winslow's soothing syrup. Radum's microbe killer. What was in them? Mostly alcohol, opium, chloroform, or some mixture thereof. It's difficult to feel ill when you're unconscious. The bottles looked trustworthy, embossed glass, elegant fonts, sometimes with Latin names. If the label said elixir, people believed it. After all, nobody ever lies in cursive. The gentle sleep. Chlorohydrate was introduced in the 1860s as a sedative. It became a favorite among insomniacs, especially poets, artists, and anyone tormented by Victorian wallpaper. It induced sleep quickly and efficiently, though it also carried the risk of addiction and fatal overdose. Doctors prescribed it freely. And when patients didn't wake up, it was called a merciful release. Medicine had a way of confusing causes with cures. The household cabinet. Imagine standing before a polished wooden cabinet in 1870. Inside, rows of glass bottles. Labels written in elegant script. Smelling faintly of alcohol and violets. It's a beautiful collection. Arsenic for the skin, mercury for the nerves, laudanum for the heart, chloroform for sleep. Every shelf gleams with faith in science, in progress, in the idea that knowledge always helps. And that's what makes it tragic. The Victorians weren't foolish. They were hopeful. They believed pain had a cure. And in chasing that cure, they swallowed the problem whole. The side effects of optimism. Each generation inherits 2 things from the last, wisdom and hubris. The Victorians had plenty of both. They conquered disease one year and caused a new one the next. To them, every bottle was a step toward modernity. Every dose a promise that humanity could master nature. And perhaps they were right, just not in the way they intended. Their experiments paved the road for modern pharmacology, anesthesia, and even hygiene. They simply walked that road barefoot on broken glass. The sleep of the age. In a way, the Victorian era was defined by exhaustion, from industrial labor, constant illness, and relentless self-improvement. Everyone was tired. Everyone wanted a cure. And so, they built a civilization on stimulants and sedatives, caffeine by day, laudanum by night. It's hard not to sympathize. Even now, we do the same, just with better packaging. A toast to the deadly cure. So, tonight, if you reach for a painkiller or a cup of tea. Spare a thought for the Victorians who did the same. Except their tea sometimes contained chloroform. They believed fiercely in better living through chemistry. And though it often killed them, it also, somehow, carried us forward. Because every discovery, even the poisonous ones, taught us something valuable. Mostly what not to do. And that, in its own quiet way, is progress. Hey everyone. You've made it this far, which is impressive. Most Victorians wouldn't have. So let's talk about what happened after you didn't. Because if there's one thing the Victorians did with true enthusiasm, it wasn't living, it was mourning. The business of bereavement. In the 19th century, death wasn't a moment. It was a lifestyle. The Victorians didn't just mourn, they scheduled it, decorated it, and, in many ways, monetized it. Entire industries thrived on grief. There were mourning warehouses where you could buy everything from black silk veils to jet jewelry carved from fossilized wood. You could order mourning stationery, mourning handkerchiefs, even mourning fans, because if you had to grieve, you might as well coordinate. Widows were the gold standard of grief. They wore black for 2 full years, sometimes longer if they enjoyed the attention. Men, naturally, were expected to mourn for 3 months, then remarry before the tea cooled. It wasn't fair. But it was tradition. Death comes home. Today, when someone dies, we tend to send them somewhere else, a hospital, a funeral home, a specialized facility. But in the Victorian age, death came to stay. When a person died, they weren't taken away. They remained in the house, washed, dressed, and carefully displayed in the parlor. That's where we get the term living room, by the way. It was originally called the parlor, the place where the family would sit with the dearly departed. Only in the 20th century did people decide perhaps they didn't want to drink tea next to Uncle Harold anymore. But for Victorians, this was normal. The deceased was part of the household until burial. Visitors came to pay respects, admire the floral arrangements, and comment gently on how peaceful the body looked. It was a strange mixture of sorrow and hospitality. Post-mortem portraits. Photography was still new and expensive. So for many families, the only photograph they ever owned of a loved one was taken after death. The practice was called memento mori, remember you must die. It was both macabre and tender, a final keepsake before the person vanished forever. Photographers specialized in the art of stillness, a skill made easier by the subject's natural cooperation. Children were posed as if sleeping. Adults were seated upright, often with open eyes painted over in the final print. Sometimes, living family members posed beside them, smiling faintly, trying not to blink, as the camera captured everyone's best approximation of eternity. The results could be haunting or oddly serene. To modern eyes, they seemed ghastly. To Victorians, they were comfort. Because when death came so frequently, and it did, remembrance became an act of defiance. Mourning jewelry. Victorians loved symbolism. They could assign meaning to practically anything, colors, flowers, birds, even knots and ribbon. So naturally, they turned grief into fashion. Mourning jewelry was made from the hair of the deceased, woven into brooches, bracelets, and intricate miniature portraits. It sounds morbid, but think of it as 19th century DNA preservation. A wearable relic of affection. Some pieces included enamel skulls, coffins, or hourglasses. Others were discreet, a simple ring with a hidden lock of hair inside. Each item whispered the same message. You are gone, but inconveniently still attached to my lapel. The rules of mourning. Victorian etiquette manuals devoted entire chapters to the proper behavior of the bereaved. How long should one wear black? How deep should one bow at a funeral? Was it acceptable to attend the opera while technically still mourning your husband? The answer, in most guides, was no, unless the opera was very sad. Queen Victoria herself set the tone. After Prince Albert's death in 1861, she wore black every day for the next 40 years. Her personal sorrow became national policy. Shops began selling widow's weeds, clothing designed specifically for endless grief. Fashion magazines offered styling tips for half mourning, where you could cautiously reintroduce shades of gray and lavender. because even despair had color theory. Mourning stationery and the art of sad correspondence. Every letter told a story. If the envelope was edged in black, it told a sad one. Families ordered personalized mourning paper with a dark border to announce a death. The thickness of the line indicated how close the relationship was, a thin edge for distant relatives, a thick one for someone dear. Imagine receiving dozens of these letters over a lifetime, each one framed in quiet sorrow. It must have been like watching the world fade to grayscale, one envelope at a time. And yet, the handwriting was always elegant. Even in grief, penmanship mattered. Mourning portraits and symbolic art. Painters, too, joined the mourning trade. Portraits featured angels, broken columns, and weeping willows, the 19th century equivalent of emoji-coded sadness. Children were often depicted as cherubs floating heavenward. Parents stood below, gazing upward with serene resignation, as though their toddler's immediate ascension were a mild inconvenience. Art softened the edges of loss. It offered a visual promise that beyond sorrow, there was beauty, or at least tasteful composition. Death in display. If you stepped into a Victorian home during a wake, you might mistake it for an art exhibit. The deceased rested on a bier, surrounded by flowers, candles, and photographs of happier times. Curtains were drawn, mirrors covered, not because of superstition, but propriety. One didn't want to accidentally glimpse one's reflection during mourning. It might seem self-indulgent. Guests entered quietly, offered condolences, and inspected the coffin's craftsmanship. It was a social event, in its way, the final opportunity to demonstrate refinement. Funerals were not private affairs. They were spectacles of piety and taste. Cemeteries of splendor. The Victorians did not believe in modest graves. They built necropolises, cities for the dead. London's Highgate Cemetery, Paris's Père Lachaise, and countless smaller graveyards became architectural masterpieces. Mausoleums with Corinthian columns, obelisks, and angels taller than houses. People strolled through them as if visiting a park. It was common to take lunch among the monuments, a practice that would horrify modern zoning boards but delighted Victorian sensibilities. To them, death was not an interruption of life but a continuation of society, relocated slightly underground. The good death. Victorians spoke often of a good death. It meant dying at home, surrounded by family, ideally after delivering a few morally uplifting final words. Children were encouraged to watch, as it built character. Servants stood respectfully at the edges, ready to bring tea, because even in death, refreshment mattered. The ideal death was peaceful, poetic, and above all, well-behaved. Suffering was expected, but panic was gauche. If one could manage a small smile and a last whispered blessing, all the better. When death was intimate. It's easy to mock these rituals from a modern distance. The hair jewelry, the photo props, the endless black lace. But beneath it all was something deeply human, an attempt to make sense of constant loss. Child mortality was staggering. Epidemics swept through cities. Medicine, as we've discussed, was more decorative than effective. So the Victorians invited death into the home because they had no choice. It was already there. By acknowledging it, dressing it, framing it, adorning it, they made it bearable. They tamed the unimaginable with manners. The lingering shadow. By the end of the century, industrialization had changed everything, including death. Bodies moved from parlors to hospitals. Funerals became professionalized. Grief became quieter, less performative, more private. And yet, something was lost. The intimacy of farewell. The visible connection between living and dead. We built sterile spaces to protect ourselves from sorrow, but in doing so, we distanced ourselves from its meaning. Victorians may have been obsessed with death, but they understood it better than we do. They looked it in the face, dressed it in lace, and said, "You may stay for tea." A soft goodnight. So, if you ever visit an old house and feel the air go still, not eerie, just watchful, you might be sensing the echo of 1,000 Victorian farewells. The faint perfume of lilies, the rustle of morning silk, the hush of candlelight. They remind us that life, in all its strangeness, ends beautifully when it's acknowledged. And perhaps a little less so when ignored. The Victorians didn't get much right about medicine or plumbing, but they understood how to make meaning out of loss. And in their own theatrical, tea-scented way, they made peace with it. Hey everyone! Still awake? Let's drift through a world where dirt was fashionable, perfume was medicine, and soap was a rumor. Because despite all the lace, jewels, and velvet, the Victorian elite were, by modern standards, a little ripe. Cleanliness and class. In the Victorian mind, being clean wasn't about hygiene, it was about decorum. It didn't matter if you smelled faintly of damp upholstery, as long as your manners were impeccable. The poor, meanwhile, were accused of being filthy because of poverty, not because they were objectively dirtier. In truth, the working class often bathed more frequently, out of necessity. Their lives were physical. They sweated. They scrubbed. The rich simply powdered over the problem. Soap, to them, was utilitarian, like stable equipment or a boot brush. Water was for watering gardens, not aristocrats. The bath that wasn't. The great myth of the Victorian age is the bathtub. We imagine claw-footed tubs gleaming in candlelight, clouds of steam rising around porcelain skin. In reality, most were decorative, like chandeliers you never turn on. A typical Victorian bather filled a basin, splashed selectively, and declared themselves refreshed. A full immersion bath was rare, reserved for illness or scandal. When they did bathe, they often used rainwater, soft, but seldom clean, and added milk, vinegar, or even wine, depending on one's recipe for moral purity. Some believed warm water opened the pores and invited disease. Others insisted soap weakened the skin. It was, in short, a hygiene philosophy based on confident guessing. The laundry divide. Clothing played a central role in Victorian cleanliness. The more layers you wore, the less of you technically existed. Undergarments, chemises, shifts, linen shirts, were meant to absorb sweat and protect outer garments from human contact. These were washed often. The outer layers, rarely. It was possible to change one's shirt daily without washing one's body at all. Many did exactly that, confident the linen had absorbed all wrongdoing. So when Victorians described someone as immaculate, they meant the laundry, not the person inside it. Perfume, the noble disinfectant. The wealthy used perfume as both decoration and defense. It masked unpleasant realities, not just personal odor, but the pervasive stench of London itself. Cities reeked. Coal smoke, horse manure, stagnant water, tanneries, breweries, and the ever-popular night soil men, those brave souls who emptied chamber pots by moonlight. Perfume was survival. Ladies dabbed rosewater on handkerchiefs. Gentlemen carried vinaigrettes, small silver containers filled with vinegar-soaked sponges to sniff when the air turned aggressive. Some believed perfume itself was medicinal, capable of warding off disease. In a way, they weren't entirely wrong. It certainly encouraged deep breathing through the nose rather than the mouth, which helped avoid fainting from the smell of the Thames. The Great Stink. Speaking of the Thames, in the summer of 1858, London experienced what newspapers politely called the Great Stink. A heat wave combined with raw sewage in the river, creating an odor so intense it shut down Parliament. Members fled, holding perfumed handkerchiefs to their faces. Queen Victoria considered leaving the city altogether. And yet, the same river supplied London's drinking water. Doctors debated whether disease came from miasma, bad smells, or animalcules, invisible creatures. Both were half right, though the first group had the easier time describing symptoms. The government eventually built a massive sewer system, engineered by Joseph Bazalgette, a man whose name deserves more statues than most generals. But before that, London was essentially marinating. Hair care, Victorian edition. Let's talk hair. Victorians adored it, long, glossy, and preferably unwashed. Washing hair with soap was rare, it was believed to dull the shine. Instead, they brushed obsessively. 100 strokes a night was considered the minimum for moral respectability. Oils, pomades, and homemade tonics kept hair manageable. Common ingredients included bear fat, rum, and occasionally ammonia, because nothing says romantic like chemical warfare on the scalp. Dandruff was politely ignored. So were lice, as long as they were discreet. Teeth, or what remained of them. Victorian dentistry was imaginative. Toothbrushes existed, often made with boar bristles. Toothpaste, however, was a luxury, and could contain brick dust, charcoal, or crushed oyster shells. Many people simply rinsed with whiskey and hoped for the best. Sugar consumption had skyrocketed, thanks to the empire's love affair with tea and colonial cane plantations, but dental care hadn't kept pace. By middle age, even the wealthy resembled piano keyboards missing several keys. False teeth were a booming trade. The best sets were made from human teeth, Waterloo teeth, harvested from battlefields. They were, technically, organic. The chamber pot problem. Indoor plumbing was still new and expensive. Most homes relied on chamber pots, porcelain bowls kept under the bed for midnight emergencies. In large households, servants collected and emptied them into cesspits or directly into the street gutters. Rain eventually took care of the rest. The result was predictable. So much so that Victorian London invented euphemisms to avoid acknowledging it. Night soil meant excrement. Dust men collected ashes mixed with whatever else households chose to discard. Cleanliness was less about removing filth than pretending it didn't exist. Health through deprivation. It's worth noting that the Victorian upper class genuinely believed too much washing could be dangerous. They thought it weakened the nerves, disturbed the natural oils, and tempted fevers to invade. Doctors recommended a sponge bath, dabbing the face and hands, perhaps the feet if one was feeling indulgent. Full baths were considered extravagant and morally suspicious. After all, if one enjoyed it, it couldn't be good for you. Children, especially girls, were discouraged from bathing too often. It was said to excite the blood. Which is a very long way of saying, the Victorians were afraid of enthusiasm. Soap and civilization. Soap, when used, was often harsh, made with animal fat and lye. It smelled faintly of tallow and repentance. Manufacturers soon discovered that adding perfumes made it more appealing. By the late 19th century, companies like Pears began marketing soap as virtue itself. Cleanliness is next to godliness became both a slogan and a threat. But behind the slogan was a quiet revolution. Cleanliness was becoming moralized. It no longer meant simply not dirty. It meant civilized. This new standard conveniently excluded those who couldn't afford fine soap, reinforcing class divisions with every bubble. Servants and the silent cleaners. Of course, the elite didn't handle their own dirt, they outsourced it. Servants bathed them, dressed them, laundered their clothes, emptied their pots, and discreetly aired out the rooms after illness or strong perfume. For the working poor, cleanliness was public, done at washhouses, pumps, or rivers. It was effortful but communal. They washed because they had to, not because it was fashionable. Ironically, the lower classes ended up cleaner, simply because they lacked anyone to delegate the task to. The moral of the soap dish. Hygiene, in the Victorian world, wasn't about health. It was about appearance. It was about smelling expensive, not clean. But slowly, science caught up. Germ theory emerged. Doctors realized perhaps invisible things could cause disease, not just bad air or moral failure. Soap became medicine. Water became safe. And gradually, people began to notice that they felt better when they didn't smell like their furniture. The fragrant illusion. Still, there's something almost charming about it, this belief that civilization could be maintained with lace, lavender, and denial. The Victorians built an empire while covered in dust and perfume, insisting it was all perfectly elegant. They were wrong, but beautifully so. And when we look back at the portraits, the letters, the polished silver, we might imagine their homes smelled faintly of roses. But behind every rose was a city still learning what clean truly meant. A gentle fade. So tonight, as you settle under your blanket, perhaps be grateful for plumbing, soap, and the quiet hum of sanitation systems we no longer notice. The Victorians taught us many things, mostly by example of what not to do. But they also taught us that civilization is fragile. And cleanliness, in the end, is less about luxury than humility. Because beneath all the lace and perfume, they were simply human, trying, failing, and faintly scented with lilac. "Hey there, still awake?" Good. Because so were they. The Victorians went to bed early, but they didn't always sleep. The bed was the center of the home, a stage where birth, death, prayer, sickness, reading, and secrets all shared the same sheets. Sleep, if it came, was just one act in a much longer play. The bed as universe. For Victorians, the bed wasn't just furniture. It was architecture. Massive four-poster structures draped in velvet and lace, part privacy screen, part symbol of moral stability. Even modest homes treated the bed as sacred ground, a place where life began and ended. People were born in their beds. They died there too. They received guests, doctors, priests, sometimes even business partners, from beneath those heavy quilts. The phrase confined to bed meant many things: illness, mourning, or simply waiting for something to pass, a fever, a heartbreak, a long winter. It was a private world within the house, where propriety loosened like undone laces. Shared beds, shared lives. Privacy was rare. In working-class homes, entire families shared one or two beds. Parents, children, even lodgers slept shoulder to shoulder. Bodies were a kind of central heating. In cities, boarding houses charged extra for single beds, single, of course, meaning alone, not clean. Even in respectable hotels, it was normal to share a bed with a stranger if rooms were scarce. Travelers wrote about these awkward arrangements with the politeness of people pretending not to notice each other's existence. A typical diary entry might read, "Shared a bed with a gentleman of tolerable disposition. He snored, but not offensively. The two sleeps." Victorians inherited an older pattern of sleep, what historians call segmented sleep. People went to bed soon after dark, slept for a few hours, then woke in the middle of the night, what they called the watch. During that time, they prayed, wrote letters, read, tended fires, or visited neighbors quietly through side doors. It was a liminal time, half waking, half dreaming, a natural intermission before second sleep. Only with artificial light and strict work hours did this rhythm fade. By late Victorian times, sleeping through the night became both a moral and medical ideal. Insomnia was born as a diagnosis, a modern problem for an increasingly anxious world. Nightwear and modesty. Even in the dark, propriety never entirely undressed. Men wore long nightshirts, sometimes buttoned to the throat. Women's nightgowns were high-necked, ruffled, and voluminous, more like small tents than garments. The idea was to maintain modesty even when unconscious. But in practice, the fabric often tangled, twisted, and betrayed its purpose. Many letters from the time complain about the suffocating weight of proper night attire. In some homes, married couples even slept in separate beds, or separate rooms, a habit more about fashion and hygiene than affection. It was believed that too much conjugal proximity drained health and moral vigor. And yet, diaries reveal that doors between bedrooms were often left accidentally unlatched. Dreams and visitations. The Victorians were obsessed with dreams. They believed the sleeping mind opened a window to the spirit world. Dream dictionaries were popular reading, guides that promised to decode visions of teeth, birds, or long corridors into moral lessons. Dreaming of white flowers meant purity. Of falling, divine warning. Of a locked door, suppressed desire. Mediums even offered dream seances, where clients described their dreams aloud while the medium interpreted their supposed spiritual messages. And of course, the line between dream and ghost story was thin. Many Victorians claimed to see dead relatives at the foot of their beds, a comfort or a curse, depending on who you asked. The sick room. When illness came, the bed became a kingdom of its own. Family members took turns tending the patient. Doctors made quiet visits, measuring pulses, prescribing tonics, or simply murmuring rest. The sickbed was often surrounded by ritual, flowers for the living, curtains drawn halfway, mirrors covered to keep the soul from escaping too soon. And when the inevitable came, the body was washed and laid out in the same bed, dressed in white, with candles burning nearby. In rural homes, neighbors came to pay respects there before the coffin was brought. The line between sleeping and dying was softer than we can now imagine. Bedtime reading. reading in bed was a guilty pleasure. It was said to strain the eyes and excite the imagination. But Victorians did it anyway. By candlelight or oil lamp, they devoured novels by Dickens, Bronte, or the newly scandalous sensation writers. Books were often kept under pillows, especially the secret ones. A woman might keep a sentimental romance or a book of poems she wouldn't dare read aloud. A man, a detective novel, or perhaps something even less moral. There's something universal in that image, the soft crackle of pages, the faint smell of wax, the comfort of being alone but not lonely. The weight of the night. For all its romance, the Victorian night was also a place of unease. Gas lamps flickered like watchful eyes. Street sounds crept through walls, horses, carriages, the cries of night hawkers, or the distant toll of a church bell marking another death. Sleep didn't always come easily. Doctors prescribed laudanum, an opium tincture, for sleeplessness, hysteria, grief, or simply nerves. It worked, but too well. Addiction crept into bedrooms across Britain under the soft label of medicine. Many poets and painters lived half their lives in that haze, half asleep, half remembering, entirely Victorian. The intimate hour. Behind closed curtains, the bed was also where the strictest morals quietly unraveled. Letters, diaries, and court cases reveal a surprisingly complex world of intimacy, tenderness, and unspoken desire. The Victorian ideal of purity was strong, but so was the pull of being human. Couples found ways to express affection within the confines of lace and linen. And servants, who moved silently through the house at all hours, saw more than anyone ever admitted. Love was a private rebellion, small gestures beneath heavy quilts, quiet laughter when the world expected silence. The eternal sleep. When Victorians spoke of death, they often said he has gone to sleep. Funeral art even depicted angels drawing curtains, or children resting peacefully under marble blankets. It was not denial, but ritual comfort. They saw sleep and death as neighboring rooms, the door between them sometimes left ajar. The phrase good night carried weight. It meant not only farewell until morning, but farewell until eternity. The bed, revisited. So yes, the Victorian bed was not simply where people slept. It was where they lived, wept, loved, and passed away. A small island of privacy in a noisy, changing world. And perhaps, when we turn off our lamps tonight, we're not so different. Our beds still hold our dreams, our loneliness, our whispered thoughts that never make it into daylight. The Victorians would understand that, I think. They just would have worn more buttons while doing it.